It was supposed to be a routine Tuesday, the kind where you count the hours between coffee refills and Slack pings, the kind where you pretend the reorg meetings are about innovation, not elimination. I'd survived enough of them to know better. We all filed into the glass conference room just before 9:0. Camden Locke stood at the front, tall, tan, and completely unaware of how little he actually knew. The son of our founder turned chief transformation officer, freshly installed, with a wardrobe straight off a DTC ad and buzzwords like velocity and ecosystem stitched into every sentence. He didn't waste time. "Thank you all for coming," he said, too cheerful for what was about to happen. We've spent the past few weeks reviewing workflows and strategic alignment across departments, and we've come to a necessary conclusion. Some people shifted in their seats. I didn't. I just watched his hands, smooth, confident, never twitching. As of today, Camden continued, we're streamlining toward a more agile future. Anyone over the age of 35, your role has reached its natural conclusion. Resignations are expected by 5 p.m. There was silence. Not stunned silence, staggered, gutted silence. A collective breath sucked out of the room and replaced with disbelief. Someone near the window let out a half laugh like they were waiting for the punchline. There wasn't one. I looked around at faces I'd worked beside for years, faces that had built Luminex from a scrappy AI consultancy into an automation giant. Gray at the temple's laugh lines that didn't come from comfort. Real workers, real minds, and Camden had just drawn a line through all of us with a single sentence. I didn't protest. I didn't cry. I closed my laptop, slid it into my bag, and stood up without a word. On my way out, I passed the espresso bar where a younger hire nervously stirred oat milk into their drink, pretending not to notice the collapse happening just feet away. A few eyes followed me, unsure whether to show sympathy or self-preservation. At my desk, I moved quietly, pulled out the drive, unplugged the charging dock, wiped the screens, a system reset, mine, not theirs. As I powered down for the last time, I glanced at the corner of my monitor where a sticky note from last quarter still clung stubbornly, Reverend 3 patent, filed. See Eric for final countersign. I smiled faintly. Camden hadn't read the filings. He didn't even know what I still owned. And that's when I knew I wasn't walking away. I was walking with something they hadn't even realized they'd lost. The last time I'd seen that sticky note, I was rushing to meet Eric Dobrin in legal before the 6 p.m. deadline. It was 2017, and we were preparing for our first platform release. Everyone was in a panic over funding, scalability, delivery timelines. No one noticed I wasn't filing those patents under Luminex's umbrella. Eric had glanced at the headers, skimmed the technical sections, then signed where I'd marked with a tab. Looks airtight, he'd said, too distracted by a licensing dispute in his inbox to ask why the ownership box listed my personal LLC Trask Systems research. I walked out of that office with 3 clean filings and no resistance. It wasn't dishonesty. It was caution. My late husband Cole made sure I understood the value of foresight. He was the one who sat me down on our back porch in Tacoma with a cup of lukewarm coffee and said, if you're going to build anything with your name attached, protect it like it's a child. Corporations forget. Paper doesn't. He died the next spring. And I kept the files locked, updated, and quietly untouched. At first, the company didn't need them. Our early models were basic, our frameworks modular. But somewhere between version 5.1 and the new rebrand, Camden's team decided to integrate all 3 of my proprietary architectures into their flagship system, now called the Camlock Cloud. They used my data scheduling logic, my dynamic security layers, my machine learning reallocation loop, even the exact naming conventions I'd used in the original spec files. And they never formalized the transfer. No buyout, no licensing agreement, just quiet assumption. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so blatant. Camden, in his crusade for fresh talent, had essentially fired the woman whose tech his empire stood on. I hadn't looked at the filings in almost 2 years, but that afternoon I pulled them up again. File dates, signatures, confirmation IDs. 3 pieces of proof that everything Luminex was now selling had my fingerprints beneath the polish. They had pushed me out of the building, but they were still standing on my foundation. And somewhere in the noise, a few voices were starting to notice who was missing. By the end of the week, the office floor plan looked like a battlefield after the smoke cleared. Desks were abandoned, mid-task Slack statuses frozen on BRB, and entire departments dissolved like they'd never mattered. Operations lost 3 leads in 48 hours. Engineering lost its memory. No announcements, no town halls, just silence where wisdom used to sit. I kept a low profile, but word traveled. The ones who left started reaching out, some angry, some just stunned. A few sent messages that only said, "I don't know what just happened." Others didn't bother with words, just emojis, a wave, a broken heart, a lock. It was Mara Edrick who called first. Former director of Ops 38, ruthless, in the best way, and the only person I ever trusted with my calendar. She asked if I'd meet her and Vernell Chen at May's Diner 2 blocks from the old server farm. I said yes without hesitation. They were already in a booth when I arrived. Mara had her hands wrapped around a chipped mug like it was the last warm thing she owned. Vernell looked like he hadn't slept, but his eyes were sharp. "No good coffee left in the building," he said by way of greeting. "Or people to drink it," Mara added. We didn't talk about what happened at first. We just shared bites of toast and the kinds of glances that only come from people who've been through the same slow-motion betrayal. Finally, Vernell broke the silence. They have no idea what they just unplugged. I took a long sip of burnt diner coffee and looked out the window where the sun had started bouncing off the glass towers of South Lake Union. Then I smiled. I do. Mara leaned forward, her voice low. "Please tell me you're not just letting this happen." I opened my bag and slid a folder across the table. Inside a printout of the patent records, an annotated flowchart, and a single line of code highlighted in red. Mara's eyes widened. Vernell let out a breath like a man who just remembered oxygen exists. "Then let's build," I said. "But this time they won't even see it coming." After I left the diner, I didn't go home. I went to the co-working space on 4th and Delaney, one of those forgotten buildings with bad lighting. No reception desk, and just enough privacy to disappear. I hadn't been there in months, not since the last time I'd booted up Canary. I built it in pieces, nights, weekends, stolen hours between launches and leadership reviews. Not for revenge, not even for recognition, just for clarity. Just to see what no one else was willing to chart. Canary didn't spy. It mapped every workflow, every unseen handoff, every name that never made it into the launch decks but carried the deadlines on their backs. It showed who built what, who fixed what, who really delivered when things went sideways. I hadn't touched the interface in nearly a year, but when I logged in, the back end was still intact. I ran the latest sync, fed it into a sandbox instance, and waited. The first reports were brutal. Since the purge, cross-departmental throughput had dropped 28%. The latency on dev to deploy was up by 40%. Client ticket closures were down. Content approvals were crawling. 3 engineering clusters were running orphaned cycles with no proper oversight. I pulled up the architecture layers Camden's team had restructured for speed. They'd severed every redundancy node Vernell built 2 years ago. They reallocated resources to the UI instead of the back-end chasing visual polish while the engine coughed beneath. I clicked open the contribution breakdown by team. It was stark. The people they'd removed, Mara, Vernell, Jenna from finance ops, Hugo from API maintenance, they weren't just efficient. They were the stabilizers, the bridges between siloed teams. And now those bridges were gone. I leaned back in the chair, fingers steepled, watching the lines pulse across the screen. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt certain. The system would collapse under the weight of its own ignorance. and I'd have the map when it did. I exported the data, labeled the file Canary Pulse, week 1, and then I opened a clean tab and started drafting the next layer, the kind that wouldn't just observe but broadcast. It happened on a Thursday just after lunch, just before the market closed. Camden's big debut streamed live from the new Luminex Media Lab, complete with LED backdrops and a rented espresso cart outside the frame. He wore a slim-cut blazer and that rehearsed grin, standing in front of the updated interface of the Camlock cloud like he'd built it himself. I watched from the corner booth at the co-working space, Mara and Vernell on either side of me, both silent. The platform launched, the demo sequence triggered, and then it stuttered, froze, timed out, twice. Camden tried to cover it with a nervous laugh, tapping the screen as though it were a fluke. But the latency was obvious. The drop-downs lagged. The data visualizations never loaded. By minute 9, the product walkthrough had collapsed into a pre-recorded fallback reel, and his smile was twitching beneath the weight of unspoken panic. Vernell looked at me. He never touched the QA checklist, did he? I opened. Canary filtered the log stream and pointed to a string of red flags. Regression protocol skipped, load test script failed silently, no rollback triggers set for live environment. They didn't test. They rushed it live without redundancy or recovery. I screen captured everything. Logs, timestamps, chain of command. And then I attached them to a fresh Proton mail address and sent the packet to someone I knew would understand what to do with it. Celia Dunn, our former director of comms, laid off the same day I was. No message. Just the files. Less than 24 hours later, a headline appeared on Tech North's morning scroll, Luminex agile or arrogant behind the scenes of a demo disaster. It didn't name names. It didn't have to. The quotes were surgical. Unvetted deployments, absent architecture oversight, decisions made by aesthetic, not infrastructure. We didn't celebrate. There was nothing sweet about watching a house burn, even one that locked you out. But we did sit quietly as the article trended. Camden hadn't just embarrassed himself. He'd exposed the hollow scaffolding he'd called strategy, and that was before the investors started asking where the patents were. By Monday, the gossip turned into fire. A short thread appeared on a niche enterprise tech forum, anonymous, concise, and deadly accurate. It questioned whether Luminex had valid intellectual property claims over its core automation modules. No links, no documents, just pointed phrasing, and a mention that the company had overlooked several filings related to its scheduling and deployment engines. That was all it took. By noon, I'd received 3 forwarded emails from former colleagues now at partner firms. Is this true? They asked, some with concern, some with awe. That afternoon, Luminex's investor hotline was flooded, and from what I heard, the board's Slack channel was spiraling. At 4:12 p.m., my personal inbox pinged from Aidan Dumont, subject. Quick question. No greeting, no pleasantries, just one line. Did you really keep the patents? I stared at the message longer than I expected. Aidan had been silent for years. Once the technical visionary of Luminex, he'd faded into advisory shadows after the Series B round, letting the board steer, while he retreated into something quieter, something less messy. But he still had power, and now he was knocking. I typed 2 sentences in reply, every signature, every timestamp, all filed independently under Trask Systems Research, confirmed by the USPTO. I hit send and leaned back, watching the Canary dashboard blink slowly on the second monitor. Red flags still pulsed across Camden's new architecture like warning flares no one understood how to read. Aidan replied 4 minutes later, "Meet me. Discreetly, tomorrow." That night, I pulled the original filings from my archive, hard copies notarized, marked with Cole's handwritten notes in the margins. I remembered him scribbling those legal amendments late into the night, whispering, "Protect it before they realize it's valuable." Now they realized, and one of the few people who could still change everything had finally reached out. Aiden chose the meeting place, a half-renovated co-working space above a shuttered yoga studio, just far enough from downtown to avoid familiar faces. I found him at a corner table. No laptop, just a legal pad and a glass of still water that he hadn't touched. He stood when I arrived. No handshake. Just a quiet nod and the kind of look that told me he wasn't here to debate. "I need to see it," he said. I opened the folder and spread out the pages. The original patent filings, my LLC documentation, the date-stamped email chain with Eric, and finally, the most damning piece, an internal memo forwarded by a friendly source with Camden's digital signature, authorizing a retroactive IP consolidation request. Aiden read silently, brow furrowed, jaw tight. He tried to backdate it, I said, after the reorg, after he fired the people who knew better. He ran a hand down the page, tapping once on Camden's name. He thought no one would check. He thought no one remembered who built the foundation. There was a long pause. Then, in a voice too quiet for the room, Aiden said, "We can take this to the board." I watched him carefully. "Only if I control the narrative." His eyes lifted, finally meeting mine. Define control. I'm not handing this over for a private reprimand or a graceful exit. I'm not here for a settlement. I want my name back on the architecture. I want the team reinstated or compensated if they won't come back. And I want the next 3 product decisions routed through oversight I choose. He didn't flinch. "You want to run the company. I want to fix it before it implodes." Aiden leaned back in the chair, folded his arms, and nodded once. "You'll have to show them what collapse looks like," he said. "I already am." I packed the papers back into the folder and stood. "I'll call the meeting," he said. "I'll bring the terms." And as I walked down the narrow stairwell and stepped into the sharp Seattle air, I knew the boardroom wasn't the battlefield. The contract was. The conference room smelled of lemon polish and nerves. The board had been called to an emergency session with no agenda attached, just the subject line IP risk review. Immediate. Aiden was already seated when I arrived, flanked by 2 empty chairs and a pitcher of untouched water. Camden stood by the windows, arms crossed like a child, refusing to come inside after being scolded. He didn't look at me. I didn't sit. Instead, I placed a single page on the center of the table. "This," I said evenly, "is a revocation of all licensing rights to Trask Systems research patents currently in use by Luminex Systems." Camden scoffed. "You can't do that." I turned to him without raising my voice. They were never purchased, never licensed, and now formally they are no longer yours to use. One of the board members, Dara Quinn, the only one who had ever bothered to remember birthdays, reached for the page, skimming quickly. Her eyes stopped halfway down, just above Cole's original counter-signature. "You filed this 6 years ago," she said, barely a whisper. I nodded. 3 patents, no transfer, all verifiable. The tech that powers Camlock Cloud relies on all the 3. Camden's face shifted from pink to white in seconds. "She's bluffing," he muttered, voice too thin to convince even himself. Aiden finally spoke, quiet and final. "She owns the building blocks. Without her, you own nothing." The room fell silent. Even the air vents seemed to pause. Camden opened his mouth again, but no words came. I waited. It didn't take long. One by one, the board members leaned back, murmured, exchanged glances. The general counsel asked to step out and make a call. When she returned, her face was unreadable, but her tone was not. "We recommend a vote," she said, "effective immediately. The result 6-1. Camden sat down without being told. I gathered the page, slipped it back into my folder, and finally took the seat across from him. No gloating, no grin, just quiet certainty. The foundation was still mine, and they knew it now, but the cleanup hadn't even started. The memo went out 2 days later. Camden Lock Chief Transformation Officer would be stepping down for personal reasons, effective immediately. No fanfare, no press statement. Just a silent line at the bottom of the morning internal update, buried beneath a staff birthday announcement, and an IT reminder about two-factor authentication. There was no mention of the vote, no hint of what really happened behind that door. But everyone knew. The same afternoon, I received an official offer returned to Luminex with a new title, Chief Systems Integrity Officer. It came with full clearance board-backed authority and an apology carefully disguised as appreciation for past and future contributions. I didn't hesitate. But I didn't return to my old office either. That glass box on the 27th floor with the view of the sound that had always belonged to someone else's ego. I requested a room 2 floors down near the original server suite. Smaller, quieter, cooler in the afternoons. They gave it to me without question. I unpacked my bag the same way I had packed it deliberately without ceremony. Vernell and Mara stopped by that evening. Mara leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and said, "Didn't think I'd be back here either." "You're not," I said. "You're forward." They didn't ask about Camden. No one really did. Rumors floated that he was already shopping consulting pitches to mid-sized firms in Phoenix. Others said his father had sent him to Europe to recalibrate. I didn't care. The point wasn't where Camden went. The point was who stayed. I pinned my original Canary printout to the corkboard beside my desk. I kept the patent folder in the drawer to my left, and I made one quiet promise to myself that every decision from this point on would be one no one could erase. By the end of the week, we had our first reorg meeting. This one didn't have a keynote, no buzzwords, no empty chairs filled by junior analysts trying to smile through burnout. Just a blueprint. And the people who actually knew where the wiring ran were holding the pen again. We didn't call ourselves leadership. We didn't need to. Titles had done enough damage. Instead, we rebuilt with intent. Vernell returned as systems flow architect. Mara reclaimed ops not as a director, but as a design lead. Others followed, Jenna, Hugo, Celia. No one asked for old positions back. They wanted something cleaner. We called it the Guardian Unit, half as a joke, half as a vow. It wasn't about guarding the company. It was about guarding the truth. The first change I made was simple. Every new proposal had to include a blueprint and a name. No more anonymous frameworks. No more decisions made in private Slack threads or shiny slide decks that forgot the people behind the work. If you suggested it, you stood by it. If you executed it, you signed it. Accountability wasn't punishment. It was recognition. We replaced the endless meetings with standing briefs. 1 per week. Everyone in the same room, same baseline, same air. No more hiding behind structureless agility. No more fragility disguised as speed. On the 3rd Friday, Celia asked if she could install something near reception. I didn't ask what. I just said yes. By Monday morning, it was mounted a small brushed steel plaque no larger than a laptop lid. Beneath the company logo in engraved serif font, it read, "Built by those you tried to bury." No signature, no explanation. The people noticed. They paused in front of it. Some smiled. One intern asked if it was real. Vernell just nodded and said, "As real as the servers." Aiden visited that afternoon. He didn't stay long. Just walked the halls, shook a few hands, lingered in the break room that used to be a shrine to Camden's barista experiments. Before he left, he stopped outside my door and said, "It feels like Luminex again." I said, "It feels like something better." That night, I reviewed our system logs. Downtime was down. Ticket closure time had improved by 36%. But what stuck with me most was the anonymous feedback form someone submitted earlier that week. This place finally breathes again, and we weren't the only ones breathing. Another email had just arrived, this one not from inside Luminex, but from someone watching closely.